very much.
Great, thank you. Welcome everyone. I'm Nat from Hackney Herbal and going to be taking you through a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of growing your own herbal tea. And hopefully this is going to give you some tips, give you some pointers and some ideas to get started. And I'll say just now, because otherwise I'll forget to say it at the end, if you're interested in learning more, we're running lots of other workshops which you can find out about on our workshop, but also sharing a lot of free resources across social media and our blog. So we're going to start with the kind of very basic principle of plants and the way that different plants grow. And this is quite an important thing to know when you're making your choices of the different herbs that you might be growing. So I'm sure as many of you gardeners will know, but there's a difference between annual plants, perennial plants and biennial plants. And as a quick recap, an annual plant is one that will complete its life cycle within one season. So for some of the herbs that we grow are things like chamomile, things like borage, things like calendula or marigolds, basil, and those are things that we'll plant in the spring. We can carry on planting them through the summer, and they'll grow and make their leaves and their flowers, and they'll set seed at the end of summer or around autumn time, and then that plant will completely die back over the winter. So those plants, we have to re-sow them every year. A lot of them will self-seed and come up by themselves, which makes our job a lot easier, but if they don't, we then have to re-sow them either in the autumn or the springtime. And one that's kind of similar to that, which is the biennial plants, do something very similar, but instead of taking one season, they take 2 seasons. So things like parsley, things like fennel. And it's useful to know this, particularly when we're thinking about which type of which part of the plant we might be harvesting for our tea. So something like fennel, which is a lovely digestive plant, we can harvest the leaves, but we can also harvest the seed to make tea. And if you want to harvest the seed, then you need to kind of be mindful that you're going to be waiting over a year before you can do that. So if you plant fennel now, then it might not be until as late as next autumn that you'll be picking the seed. So it's something to think about, maybe if you've got limited space or if you've only got your space for a short amount of time, these things can really influence your choice. And then the final group, the perennial herbs, which a lot of what we grow actually falls into, are the plants that will grow on year after year for 3 or more years. So conveniently, a lot of herbs are perennials. And this just means that once we've got an established plant, provided we don't kill it or something else doesn't kill it, we'll have it for the long run and we'll can benefit from it year after year. So when you think of all the Mediterranean herbs like rosemary and thyme and lavender and sage, those are all the kind of woody perennial plants and can be quite nice in your garden or your space because they provide a structure year round and are always there for you to look at. And then the other type of perennials are the herbaceous perennials, and those are the more kind of fleshy plants. They also kind of have a group which are more tender, and what they will do is they'll die back over the winter. So if you think about things like lemon balm or things like marshmallow, which is a lovely herb for the respiratory system that we make a cough medicine from, or something like valerian, which is a really powerful sleep remedy, those plants will grow through the spring and the summer, and they'll make their flowers and they'll produce seed. And what they'll do kind of towards the end of summer and the beginning of autumn is they'll start to pump lots of energy and nutrition back into their root supply. And that then gives them a store of energy from which the following spring they can regrow. But over winter, their top growth will disintegrate and disappear. So let's say you were only to grow annuals and herbaceous perennials in your garden, you wouldn't have very much to look at over the winter. There'd be not much there that you could use or be seeing. So it's just something to think about, and also to remember that herbaceous perennials aren't dead if they're not there. They're very much alive. They're just dormant underneath, and they're kind of I think they're one of the most exciting things to grow, because when they start poking up in early springtime, it's a really nice sign, and it's a really exciting kind of signal that spring is here and we've survived winter and longer, warmer days are around the corner. So those are just things to remember, and it's good to check what you're growing in terms of those types. And another really important thing to think about is your site. So the space that you have, the conditions there, how much sun does your space get, what's the soil like, is there wind? And for most of the herbs that we grow, another really nice thing about them is that they will grow happily in containers and pots, as well as being in the ground. So if you don't have any kind of physical ground to grow in, then you can still have a lot of these plants in containers. And most of the herbs we grow will love being in full sun. Some of them will tolerate being in a more shady space, or a space that maybe gets around 4 or 5 hours of sunlight and then shade for the rest of the day. So things like mint and lemon balm, things like fennel that can grow quite tall and find light can be useful things to try if you have a site that doesn't get sun throughout the day. Particularly if in an urban area, which can be overlooked. But generally, it's good to kind of position your herbs in the sunniest spots. So all the Mediterranean herbs, if you think of where those would be in their kind of native environment, they would be sitting on a sun-baked, rocky, free-training, sunny, rocky side in Italy, let's say, which is realistically where we'd all like to be right now. So you want to try and give something of these conditions to the plants in your own spaces.
Nat, what about having them indoors, which is the condition where most of us are right now?
Yep. So I'm going to come on. I'll talk about some choices for indoors as well. So you can grow. You can still grow whatever your conditions if you don't have any outdoor space. So for those who are growing things outside, whether that's in the garden or in a pot on a balcony, kind of if you're growing in containers, my kind of go-to mix for containers is to have half topsoil and half compost. And that will give you a nice structure. It will create a nice structure that the roots of your plants can grow through, as well as giving them a little bit of initial nutrition and feed from the compost. And the compost also helps to hold a lot of moisture. So that's what I would give to my perennial plants, which are going to be there for the long run. And I would say if you're growing perennials in a pot, then it's good to have between sort of 20 centimeters depth. And the general rule is that the bigger pot or container your plant is in, the bigger it can get, and the bigger the plant, the more yield you'll be able to harvest from it. If you're growing in the ground, or maybe in a raised bed, whatever soil you're starting with, whether that's silty, sandy, heavy clay, you can do wonders by adding in compost either across all of your ground or purely in the space where you're going to be planting. So if you've got very heavy clay soil, then you can add a lot of compost. You might also want to add in things like grit and sharp sand, stones, or any kind of rubble for extra drainage for those Mediterranean plants that you might be growing. So things like thyme, rosemary, lavender, they really hate sitting in heavy clay over the winter. If you're growing things like mint and lemon balm, they're a little bit less fussy. They'll happily be in a kind of a damper soil or in a kind of heavy kind of composted soil. You don't need to worry about enhancing drainage there too much. So these are sort of some of the basic things, but it's good to kind of check and to look up for the type of herb that you're growing, what conditions it enjoys. And you can either around your garden or raised beds kind of group plants with the same requirements together, or you can use a pot. And the beauty of growing things in pots is you can create exactly the right soil conditions for them. If you are growing annual plants, or if you're growing things on a windowsill, then you can get away with just using compost and not worrying about the topsoil mix. I'm really big on soil and compost mixes and spend a lot of my time doing that. So I do grow all my annuals, the ones that are in pots also have that mix. But because those plants will only be growing for one season and not, really bedding themselves down in the same way that a perennial plant would do, you can get away with just using just compost without adding any topsoil in. So kind of leading on from that, in terms of your plant choices. So I'll pick up the question about indoor plants. So I will be honest with you, a lot of herbs will not enjoy being indoors. So some of the Mediterranean plants, some of the plants that traditionally grow in marshland and want to be really huge giants, will really struggle being in a tiny pot with not enough sunlight and having to struggle with, the humidity and heating and things. But there are some things that you will be really good to have indoors. So basil is really nice thing to grow inside and will also benefit from the added warmth of an indoor space. And there's lots of different varieties of basil you can grow, and they're all delicious in a tea. So if you have any dried basil in your spice rack, I encourage you to try that. It's a really lovely fragrant thing to have. The other things you can grow indoors, so mint and lemon balm will do okay inside. Also another thing, actually something I've got here, which is a scented geranium, is a really nice thing to grow inside, and you can use it to make hot tea, but I use it a lot to make a cold tea, or a cold infusion where you just soak it in water overnight. So that's a nice indoor choice. Thyme I've found kind of can also be okay inside. Thyme's a really lovely herb for kind of helping our bodies to fight colds and flus. It's a really good antiviral plant. You can obviously use it in cooking, as well as in your teas. And then some of the other things I've tried, which can be a bit temperamental, rosemary generally doesn't really like being inside that much. But what I always say, to maybe contradict myself, is to always experiment with things. But make sure if you're growing them inside, that you've got them next to the window that gets the most sunlight. So unlike houseplants, which can survive without any direct sunlight, the herbs really need sun to grow and be healthy. Another thing you can grow inside for teas and as an edible flower are marigolds or calendula. And those are also a really nice thing to add into your teas. Nice kind of flowers, make a nice floral blend.
Nat, can I just quickly ask a question about the geranium that you've got?
Yes.
What parts would you use for making tea?
So what I would do is I would just pick off a few of the leaves. You can use the leaves and the flowers. But 2 or 3 leaves in a glass of water will give you a really nice infusion. And there's so many different varieties. So the scented geraniums are their kind of botanical name is Pelargonium graveolens. There are some other scented geraniums, but those are the main ones that we use. This one, mine are all muddled up. I think this one is Attar of Roses, which is a really lovely rose scented geranium. But there's lots that you can choose from. And then a few more other points on picking different herbs for your space. So if you've got a small space but you've got lots of vertical space, or you might have a balcony, then choosing things like climbing roses. So you can make tea from any kind of scented rose. The damask roses are the kind of very highly scented ones to get, but equally lots of English roses and other hybrids carry scent. So just pick any scented one, and one that has a climbing habit. Jasmine is another really nice climbing plant to grow, that doesn't take up very much space, can fill a wall or even a railing on a balcony. And you can get either the evergreen variety or the officinalis jasmine, which is kind of the slightly more medicinal one, but both of them give you a lovely scent. And then otherwise, just kind of picking the ones that you like. So as I was saying before, if you've got a sunny space, you can kind of go for it with a lot of the Mediterranean plants, and grow those in pots. Or equally, if you've got a garden, you can kind of fill it up with lots of different things. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of my favourite tea herbs as we finish. I can see that question. Yep, you just use the jasmine flowers for tea. And if anyone is able to go on little walks out in their area, jasmine is something that tends to spill over people's fences and people's walls. There's a really lovely one at the end of my road that I pick just to smell, actually. Even just picking a tiny bit of the flower and bringing it into your house will just fill your house with a lovely aroma. So I'm going to move on to harvesting. So of all the different kind of herbs that we grow, we also use different parts of the plant for the tea. So what have I got here? So I've got some rosemary and things like sage that we would use the leaves of the plant. And those are things that we would harvest a lot during spring and summer. And then kind of later in the summer, we'll start harvesting flowers. So haven't got many of those to show you because they're not flowering yet. These things are flowering. But we would harvest things like chamomile, calendula, roses. With a lot of those flowers, the rule kind of goes is the more you pick the flowers, the more flowers will produce. For those, not all plants, but for those particular ones. And that's generally because the plant is flowering predominantly to make seed to be able to reproduce. So if you take the flowers before the plant has made its seeds, the flowers then got to make, it's like got to make another flower to be able to complete its life cycle. So by picking, you extend the harvest. And something like chamomile or marigold, you could be out picking those day after day to keep them going. Then later in the season, as we go into autumn, we also start to harvest the roots of the plants. So you might harvest, if you've got a bigger space, and you can grow some of the bigger plants like marshmallow or valerian, which we use the root of the plant for. Also, if you've allowed dandelions to grow at home, you can use the dandelion root to make not so much a tea, but a kind of, it's called a coffee substitute, which I think is a little bit generous, but you can make a really nice nutty drink with dandelion root and any milk of your choice, and that's a really nice thing to have for your liver, really good for detoxing. And then we also will harvest berries and fruits. So right now, if you're in London, is a really good time to go and forage for elderflower. But it's always good to be mindful not to pick all the flowers, so that in the autumn, those flowers will then turn into the berries, and you can make really lovely berry teas. Equally with things like rose hips, you can pick those and turn those into teas. So through the season, we're kind of harvesting different parts of the plant. And
when you pick a flower, Nat, do you pinch it or do you cut it?
If you've got good fingernails, you can pinch it. It depends really. Some things you can snap off quite easily. Sometimes if you kind of try and pull things, you end up, something like chamomile is probably better to cut, because if you pull it, you can end up pulling the whole plant out of the ground. It doesn't have very deep roots. You can get quite into it. So with marigolds, you can kind of, what I tend to do is cut the stem back to a point at which you can see another flower bud coming, and that kind of keeps the plant really compact and means you don't have lots of just stalks where you've picked the flower sticking out. but equally the plant will carry on growing. It's more just if you are being a bit more fussy about it. And I've got a bit of lemon balm here, which I just wanted to show you. So a lot of the plants and the herbs that we've talked about are in the mint family. So the kind of family which is categorized by a square stem. And they all kind of have a similar structure in the way that they grow. And it's really useful to look at this when you're harvesting. So hopefully you can see this. So this is lemon balm that I've just got in a pot, and along the stem there are very distinct points at which the leaves are coming out, and these points are where all the kind of growth hormone is contained, which is why they're growing from that point. So what is really good to remember when you're harvesting is to always cut above a set of leaves. So if I was going to just harvest a bit now to have for tea, or lemon balm is actually really nice in a stir fry, or for any kind of any food that you want lemony scent. It's also a very nice sedative. I'll just cut here, save that bit for later, and then what you can hopefully see is oh look, there's a ladybug larvae there. Anyway, these two bits here are now going to carry on growing and make 2 additional stems, and that's going to then encourage the plant to bush out. And if I had not harvested this and just let it grow, that kind of dominating top growth would just go, and it would mean the plant would start flowering much sooner in its life cycle than if we hadn't cut it. And for something like lemon balm, once it's flowered, it loses pretty much all its flavour. So it's one that you want to harvest before it's flowered. So actually, by harvesting your herbs, you increase the overall kind of harvesting period and the season at which you'll be able to pick them. And that is the same for rosemary, sage, thyme. Basil is another really good one to do it. Also, if you buy basil from the supermarket, just start initially by cutting all the tops off just above a set of leaves, and that will prolong its life. So if you were doing something like rosemary, which I've got here, it's exactly the same. Rosemary, just it's the leaf nodes are a lot closer together, so you just have to kind of bend these down. And if I was to cut, I don't know if you can see this, there, then you've got exactly the same thing. So these 2 were the first leaves, and then these 2 bits here are going to carry on growing and again make that plant bush out more. So that's harvesting tip. And generally you don't want to harvest more than 1/3 of the plant at a time. The exceptions to that are things like mint and lemon balm, also nettles, which again you might not want in your garden, but you can go and forage for, and are really lovely, again really nice detoxing tea. So those you can pretty much cut them right back to the ground and they will grow up again, but they'll take a lot longer to regrow than if you were to just trim about 1/3 off the top of them. And if you're harvesting any of your kind of woodier perennial plants, you don't really want to be cutting into any hardwood, which sometimes some of them will regrow from hardwood. Sage is one that can often regrow from hardwood, but generally things like lavender and rosemary, if you cut into wood, it's not going to grow back. So you want to make sure you're picking the bendy new growth on your plants. And I'm just going to quickly talk about drying, and then we'll have some time for questions. So it's good to have a mix of both fresh tea and dry tea. And generally what I do and we do at Hackney Herbal is enjoy as much fresh as we can, kind of particularly at this time of year and through the summer when there's, the plants are really abundant, there's loads growing. And then we aim to kind of dry and process enough so that when some of these plants die back in the winter, or we're not able to pick them as much because they're not really growing, we've got a nice stash to use during the winter months. So kind of 2 main ways of harvesting, of drying. So the first one is to hang things up. So anything that you can harvest on a stem, so if you had a little bunch of rosemary like this, wrap a string, or you can use an elastic band quite tightly around it. You want to tie them really tightly, because what happens as these dry, the stems will shrink, and if you don't do your knots tight enough, all your herbs will end up on the floor, which is a bit of a pain. And then you want to just hang them somewhere where they don't have any direct sunlight on them, somewhere really dry, which sounds a bit silly, but somewhere really well ventilated. So it doesn't necessarily have to be really warm, but needs to kind of have a good airflow, not be damp or humid, and you don't want any direct sunlight on them, which can then make their oils evaporate very quickly, so you end up with a less kind of tasty dry herb. So that works for things on a stem. If you're harvesting flowers, then you need to kind of lay them out on something. So if you've got any kind of basket or kind of trays, you can use those. You can also just put a tea towel on a shelf out of the way somewhere, or on a surface, and just lay your flowers on top. You want to just, again, not put them all on top of each other, really kind of separate them so they've got space to dry. These things are really great. If anyone's from a community garden, you'll know exactly what this is. So these are mushroom crates, so they're kind of what mushrooms get delivered in. Again, something you might be able to find if you're out and about on a walk. You might find them kind of in the street outside a cafe or something. And they're great because they're full of holes. So you can take them home, give them a really good clean, and then for some of the smaller flowers, we'll just line this with a piece of old paper or something, or kitchen towel, and just lay out our flowers. And the beauty of those things is they stack, so you can get a whole set of them and stack them up, and they work really, really well for drying things. And then storing, I tend to kind of store things at home just in jam jars or old Tupperware, somewhere kind of in the cupboard with your dry goods in an airtight container. And finally, I'm just going to talk through, I've got like a short list of top herbs, which is really hard to do because I'll make tea out of absolutely anything. But I've done them as blends. So rosemary, basil and mint together is a really lovely, uplifting, very refreshing blend. One which is like summer, just like a summer thing all year round that you can have, is actually one of our blends, which is called the TLC blend, which is lemon, verbena, rose and elderflower. So both the rose and the elderflower you can forage for. You can forage for wild roses. This is lemon verbena, which if you grow one thing for tea, actually just grow this. This is a really lovely fragrant herb. Works amazingly on our nervous system. It's very calming. It's really good for sleep. I wish Zoom had a smell function. So it's basically like lemon sherbet. So it might remind you of your childhood and sweets and things, but yeah, it's absolute joy to grow. And then finally, a nice digestive blend that you can make from chamomile, fennel, either the seed or the leaf, and lemon balm is really nice for your tummy. There's so many others that are great in tea, but those are just, top 9 to grow. Yeah, so that's quite a speedy tour through the very basics of growing your own herbal tea. I'm sure you've got loads and loads of questions, so I've left time for that, because that's kind of the benefit, I think, of these sessions. All of this information exists somewhere online, a lot of it on our own website, but it's nice just to be able to ask answer your questions.
I have one, Nat, that was asked a little bit earlier, and I was kind of saving it for the end. So you mentioned elderflower and roses as something that we could forage almost. Is there anything else that we can think about herbs to forage, keep an eye on?
Yeah, definitely. There's loads. So things like nettles, we would normally forage for those a little bit earlier in spring. But if you just look a little bit harder, you'll normally always be able to find a patch that haven't yet flowered. So nettles, you want to make sure you're picking them before they've flowered. So usually you can find a patch growing in the shade at this time of year. And actually by picking a few means you can then come back to them later and keep harvesting. So things like nettle. You can also harvest for hawthorn. It's a nice thing to harvest at the moment, either the leaves or the flowers. What else can we harvest? Yeah, elderflowers a lot at the moment.
Lime tree.
Has anyone else got any ideas? I heard something.
Lime tree.
Oh yeah, lime tree is a great one. So a lot of the lime trees around here are really, really tall. So they're obviously very high up, but lime blossom is a really lovely thing. Really sweet, really good for stress and burnout. And yeah, really, really delicious. And a lot of these things are quite different in taste when you have them fresh compared to dried. So it's really good to have a think about those, just taste them in different states.
Nat, are there any mixes of herbs that we should avoid that could be dangerous?
Any mixes? They're not so much dangerous, but it is worth checking. So if you are taking lots of medication, or if you're taking any medication, if you're pregnant or nursing, or if you have a pre-existing condition, it's always good to check with either your GP or with a medical herbalist before you start suddenly taking loads and loads of herbs. Generally as teas, the kind of medicinal dose is very low and is kind of safe, but it's always worth checking. So something I mentioned, actually, valerian, which is sometimes given the nickname of nature's Valium, is a kind of very strong, kind of tranquilizing herb. And that sometimes is not advised if you already have quite a low mood, or if you're on antidepressants. It can also become addictive. So these are kind of still really powerful things that we're working with, and it is good to be mindful of that.
Great
Yeah.
that you mentioned valerian again, because one of the questions was around harvesting roots. So how do we harvest the root? How do we dry a root for something that we want to make tea out of?
Yeah, great question. So when you're harvesting roots, you can do it in a way in which you don't sacrifice the whole plant. So for a lot of things, again, there are always some exceptions, but generally speaking, we wait until a plant is about 3 years old, so that it's kind of, the root has established enough to warrant harvesting. And we do that kind of through the winter when the plant is dormant. So we dig up the whole thing, and then we trim maybe around 2/3 of the root, or maybe about half of the root, and then we plant the plant again. So that's kind of that's sort of the general way of doing it, just trimming. You can, if you've got a big space and you're growing loads, then you can kind of, take half of your stock and use all of it, because you've still got some in the ground. But we would, trim off a little bit, then plant the other thing back, and then give it a good clean, and then chop it up. And we tend to air dry things a lot, but you can also use a dehydrator. So dehydrator can be quite useful for drying more fibrous things like roots and berries. So you might do that. If you don't have that, then you can just chop your roots really, really finely. Generally, the oven, it's hard to get the oven at a low enough temperature which won't damage your herbs. Sometimes you can get away with putting it on a very low setting and like keeping the door open for drying out roots. But we wouldn't do that for flowers and leaves. It's too hot.
Cool. Then we have a couple of questions that are slightly, some concerns there. So what do we do about spittlebug? Someone seems to be having a problem with that. And what does it mean when my rosemary is flowering?
Okay, I'm going to just do a plug here. Camilla, who is part of the Hackney Herbal team, is doing a wonderful workshop on pests and diseases at the beginning of June. So if you want to learn more about that, check in. The spit, do you mean, I think you're referring to the thing that makes the spit on the plant. So that doesn't actually create any long-term damage to your plants. Actually, a lot of pests generally, like aphids and things, as long as you don't have really big infestations of things, a lot of the herbs in the plants will tolerate these things, and will happily have these things feeding off them. So you don't have to worry about those things too much. If you pick a bit with that on, then you might want to rinse that off before you use that bit of the plant. But generally, that's not going to cause any long-term problem. If your rosemary is flowering, then you need to just enjoy that, because that's an amazing thing. And you can also eat the flowers, actually. So if you pick a few flowers, and if you've got there before a pollinator, then there'll be a lovely bit of nectar inside that flower, so you can pick those off. And for all of the Mediterranean herbs, it's only really lemon balm, which out of that kind of group of aromatic plants, that loses some of its flavour when it's flowered. All the other ones, like sage and thyme and rosemary, you carry on harvesting those after they've flowered.
Great. And then we have a couple of brave questions. So, can we use horseradish in tea, and can we grow ginger from roots when we buy at the supermarket?
Yes, very good question. So horseradish, I don't think I've had horseradish in the tea. No, but I would say try. Another really nice thing to do with horseradish is to infuse it in vinegar. And Eleanor and I actually were just talking before we started about making something called fire cider, which is like a really strong, punchy infused apple cider vinegar. And you just pack that with ginger, garlic, chilies. You can put rosemary and sage, horseradish, and it creates a really strong tonic that you can take when you've got cold or flu. It's all the anti, so it's antibacterial, antifungal, antiviral, antiseptic, anti-everything. So it's a really good tonic, but also great to have to keep you warm over the winter months. But yes, try horseradish in the tea. I encourage you to do that.
Let us know, maybe put in the feedback. Let us know how it went, Maria.
And yes, ginger you can definitely grow from ginger from the supermarket. So I'm actually have got it isn't here. This is why I'm in here, because I have all my props. So this is turmeric, which I grew from a little piece that I had, actually probably left over from fire cider making, which was kind of in my fruit bowl and had started to sprout. So you can do the same with ginger. And what's quite good to do is when you're buying your ginger, if you're choosing it yourself, is try and find a bit with a little kind of eye thing on it, and that's where it's going to sprout from. And you can either just leave it in your fruit bowl until that kind of starts to sprout a little bit, or you can just break off that chunk and put it in a pot with some compost. And then you want to put it somewhere really warm to get it going. So it doesn't need to be, if you've got a sunny space at this time of year where you can put it, that's great. If not, just somewhere kind of warm, and keep it well watered, and it should sprout.
Mm-hmm.
And keep it, I mean, it will be fine over the summer, but it will need to come indoors over the winter.
Okay. There are 3 more questions, and then I think we are there with the time, Nat. So would you relist the ingredients that you put in your fire cider? Because I know what I put in mine, but I'd rather it coming from you.
Yes, I think the recipe is on a blog on our website. So we can maybe, I don't know, send the link to that, or if you just can be bothered to scroll back through our blog post, it is on there. It's basically anything you have which is spicy or fiery.
So I use ginger, leek, garlic, horseradish, pepper, these kinds of things. Chili,
chili, garlic, cayenne. And again, it's a very long list of things, and if you don't have all of those things, even using half of what is on that list will give you something really, really tasty.
Right. And going back to the lime tree for a second, obviously we've got a pollution problem in London. How far should we go from the road before we pick any of the leaves to feel safe?
Yeah, really good question about pollution. So I tend to think, I tend to err on the side of, if we're living in a city, us ourselves are breathing this stuff in all the time, and equally our plants that we're growing are kind of doing the same. But it is worth trying to, if you're foraging or picking things, to avoid kind of a main, like right next to a main road. I've read various different studies and things, and it seems to be that actually not that far back from a main road, and if you've got some trees or a barrier in between that, can be a really good kind of barrier. But it's also good to look, so particularly for things like lime and also elderflower, you'll kind of see on the leaves and the flowers like a horrible kind of sticky blackness, which sometimes is kind of aphid juice, but is also sometimes just the gunk that gets stuck to the plants from kind of car fumes and things. So it's good to just pick something that looks really healthy, something that doesn't have a lot of dust or other kind of material or debris on it. And yeah, just avoid main roads. I mean, I'm not sure where all of you are. I know a few of you where you are, but in Hackney, we're really lucky that we have the marshes and the canal and lots of really lovely kind of wild spaces. So I appreciate it in the times we're in. It can be a bit difficult, but kind of in best practice, it's good to kind of go on a little journey somewhere away from kind of busy roads and things, and just pick what looks really healthy.
Right. I'm going to steal 1 more minute from you and from everyone to ask one, if you can list maybe 2 or 3 herbs that are good to relax muscles. And then what you can tell us about something that I don't even know how to pronounce. Chervil?
Chervil, okay.
That one.
Yes, muscle relaxant. So you want anything which has like an anti-inflammatory action, or another kind of herb term we use is anti-spasmodic, which just means it relaxes muscle spasm. So rosemary is a really good one. So you can take that as a tea. You can throw a few sprigs into the bath. You can also mix some essential oil in your bath, or mix it in with an oil and use that as a kind of massage rub. You can also use, actually ginger is a really nice one because it's also very warming. Also ginger essential oil, again, ginger and rosemary essential oil together would work really well in a cream or a rub. You could also use any of the sedative herbs as well that will also kind of help to relax your emotional side, which can sometimes be where all the tension comes from. So things like lemon balm, or also things like chamomile, which is another nice anti-inflammatory. And finally, passion flower. So the passion flower that we tend to have here is a kind of more ornamental one, which doesn't have as much medicinal value as the passion flower kind of dried herb that we would use, but is a really lovely analgesic plant, so it has a natural pain relief. So that's one to try. And then chervil. So I haven't, I actually tried to grow some chervil from seed, and it hasn't germinated very well because I think I've got quite old seeds. But it's a nice digestive plant. Again, I don't think I've made tea from that. Shouldn't really admit that, but I'm happy to be honest about it. But yeah, it's nice. It's quite nice chopped up in a salad as well, quite fragrant. Should be fairly straightforward to grow from seed. I think the seeds I've got are about 5 years old, so they haven't germinated yet. Or it could be slow, like parsley, which is also very slow.
And are there any books or stockists that you would recommend for people?
Yes, there are quite a few. Actually, there's one that hasn't even come out yet, which is due to come out soon, which is a book called Self-Sufficient Herbalism, I think, something like that. And it's by an amazing herbalist called Lucy Jones. And it's she's a herbalist and she has an allotment, and she grows pretty much all the herbs that she uses in her clinic and dispensary. And the book is all about growing, harvesting. I think there's like a directory of about 100 plants in it, showing you how to grow them, when you should pick them, how they should be processed. So we're really eagerly awaiting that book, which will probably become a very important book for people wanting to grow their own herbs. Otherwise, so Jekka McVicker, who's kind of very famous herb grower, has a lot of lovely books, very focused on growing. In terms of kind of more medicinal uses of plants, there's a Neil's Yard book, which I didn't bring out as part of my props. It's the blue book, but it's the Neil's Yard, I think it's called Herbal Remedies book, which you can buy from Waterstones. They don't always have it in the Neil's Yard shop. Well, we can't go to the shop now anyway, but yeah, you can find that one.
Excellent. Thank you so very much. We've gone a little bit over time. I hope everybody was okay with staying a little bit longer. Thank you. Thank you so much, Nat. It's been great. I think we're all gonna go and make some muscle relaxants and relaxing teas and all of that, and cope with this very strange situation. I'm just gonna remind everyone, you're gonna get an email with a link. Please do the feedback. It's really helpful for us, and if you can donate anything, we would very much appreciate. Nat has done this out in her free time, so I'm sure that sharing with the trainers what we can make, it would be great. I'm going to ask everybody to progressively leave and go and make your own tea tonight.
Yeah, thanks everyone for
joining.
Thank
you very much. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you. I think Fiona is going to stay.
Oh yeah, I saw Fiona there.
Okay, I'm going to give everybody another few seconds before I remove.
Yeah, sometimes it's hard to find the leave button.
I know. And then sometimes you just want to leave a room and then you end the meeting and it just ends in chaos. Yeah. Like, no. Okay. You Nat, you've met Fiona already then?
Yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
That was great.
Yeah, it's kind of I could sit here all night just answering questions about herbs quite happily.
It was really funny because I made a quick dash at 5 o'clock to go for a run on the marshes, and I was kind of fixated on the nettles and the elderflowers, and so I'd kind of come in fresh from that to hear your talk. It was really nice.
Oh, nice, nicely themed. I've got this this ladybug larvae thing just crawling all over my screen, going wild. Maybe it doesn't end up being the laptop.
They still seem to have Klee, but I think it's just I think they've left already and it's just not updating the thing anyway. Thank you so much, Nat. That was great. How did you feel? How was it for you?
Yeah, it was good. I always find like I could just talk for hours about obviously this. So it's kind of, yeah, it's kind of hopefully just, I mean, there's so much more to cover, but hopefully just giving people a little bit of inspiration and
yeah, for sure. I mean, the in the chat, the comments were really good. So I think everybody definitely took something away from it, and they're all gonna go and grow lemon verbena now.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, it's nice there were so many. Do you know how many people there were in the end?
Yeah, so we were swinging with sort of 50-51, which means that there were 48 to 49 people.
Oh wow!
Apart from you and you, obviously. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nat, so I'm really curious, when you do these, what are you looking at? Are you talking to faces, or do you just minimize your screen and look at
well, so for the other workshops I've been doing, I've had like kind of like a presentation that I sort of go through. So I usually kind of have that, and I kind of, for this, I just thought it'd be nicer just to do it as like a bit more just seeing a face as opposed